Who could have known that a neighborhood so quiet and peaceful could be home to such a horrific murder? Dasmariñas is a lively growing community nestled just south of Manila in the Philippines. It's the kind of place where neighborhoods are incredibly close-knit, where children play in narrow streets, and the smell of home-cooked meals drifts through open windows. Dasmariñas is known for its blend of rural charm and urban sprawl, a city in transition where traditional markets sit beside modern malls, and new housing developments are slowly replacing rice fields. However, beneath its warm family values, Dasmariñas, much like any other place, has its shadows. And in today's case, we won't be looking at a distant, dangerous city or dark alleyway, but instead, we'll be stepping inside a modest family home in a seemingly safe neighborhood. A home where secrets were quite literally buried, and this is where the story of Evelyn Sayos begins. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at two cases out of Southeast Asia, both of which you've probably never heard of before. We'll first be looking at the case of Evelyn Sayos, which happened over in the Philippines over a period of around 4 years. Now this one is a story of a mother's love betrayed in the most horrific of ways, a cover-up which lasted almost half a decade and left everyone wondering why. Honestly, this is the sort of story that will leave you haunted. Alright, let's jump straight into this one today, folks. Before we begin, please do subscribe if you like true crime, strange or chilling stories. Now, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. Refocusing on the city of Dasmariñas, Evelyn was a 54-year-old woman who had spent most of her life here. Through tragedy, she, unfortunately, was a widowed single mother of 2 children named Joanna and John, and had been raising them on her own ever since her husband passed away when both of them were still very young. But despite her loss, Evelyn kept going. Her friends saw her as kind, strict, deeply loving, and always worked very hard to support her kids. Moving through their teenage years, it was quite evident that she had put them through good schools, made sure that they had food on the table, and always provided a stable home. Of course, there were many inevitable difficulties, especially as a single parent. But Evelyn, she really did try to make it work. Now, despite the family not being rich, she did inherit a house in Singapore from her late husband. A house that eventually became a symbol of escape, and a place that she would occasionally visit whenever she needed a break. But, of course, being a single parent, she rarely had that luxury. People who knew Evelyn described her as resilient, and the type of mother who would never give up on her children. Now, you could say that she was likely damaged in her own kind of way. Of course, the death of her husband would have caused immeasurable pain, and she likely placed all of that extra love onto her children. And unfortunately, this would cause problems between the 3 of them, especially with her daughter Joanna. You see, where John was more mature and reserved, Joanna was more the rebellious type of teenager. Joanna was the kind of person who would party often, drink heavily, and sleep around. In fact, by the age of 16, she was pregnant by her boyfriend Ronald Ruby. And this left her mother Evelyn both furious and deeply embarrassed. You see, she believed that her daughter deserved so much more in life before she became a mother. However, despite her concerns, both Ronald and Joanna were rather determined to keep this baby. And when the baby was finally born, well, Joanna and Ronald did not want to get married either. And this left Evelyn and her rather traditional beliefs absolutely furious. There were clearly problems in the household, but Evelyn decided that she would still continue to support her daughter no matter what. In response, she would often look after the baby, help raise the child, buy formula and everything else required, and even pay the bills. But there is no denying that the emotional strain between the two was not only growing, but becoming a big issue. Joanna was still quite the immature and reckless kid, even after giving birth, and whenever Evelyn stepped in to try to help her, well, she wasn't having any of it, and this would often lead into huge arguments between the two. Now, Evelyn, she still loved her daughter to immeasurable lengths, and there was no question about that. However, what she didn't know is that things were slowly starting to unravel beneath her feet. A darkness was growing inside her home, and soon enough, she would vanish without a trace. August the 20th, 2016. What began as a regular workday eventually bore some strange and unfamiliar news to Evelyn's circle. After one of her friends had reached out to ask her if she would like to meet for coffee, Joanna responded for her mother by saying that she had left for Singapore to, quote, relax and clear her head. As the day progressed, this news was shared amongst the rest of her family and friends, and although it was rather unexpected, nobody questioned it at first. Although money was tight, Evelyn did have the means to go. I mean, she owned a house there already, and had even talked about needing some time away from the family. Of course, the main reason behind this was with what was going on with her daughter, Joanna. It wasn't news to anyone that the relationship between them was strained, and Evelyn had been spending most of her time juggling between work and also looking after her granddaughter. You see, in order to save money, Joanna still lived at home with her mother, the baby, and Ronald. And being the rather reckless and carefree person that she was, she would sometimes leave the property in the evenings, which in turn would leave her baby with her mother. It is no surprise that Evelyn felt quite hard done by with this. She had just spent the last 20 years raising her children as a single mother, and now, when it was finally time for her to have her own life, well, it kind of felt like her daughter was just making her repeat the entire cycle all over again. And so, who was anyone to judge Evelyn for needing some time away to find herself again? But as the days turned into weeks, something began to feel off, and when 1 month became 2, her friends concluded that this was wildly out of character. Even stranger, although Evelyn was active on Facebook and occasionally posted updates on her timeline, she seemed to refuse all other forms of communication. There were no phone calls, no video chats, no selfies from the airport, or any updates from Singapore. Which is odd because historically, she would always share this with friends. It was around this time that her friends noticed that her posts were short, impersonal, and out of character. Not only was she not using emojis anymore, but her whole kind of way of interacting seemed to be extremely stiff and not the usual Evelyn. And whenever her family members tried to call her, well, she wouldn't pick up the phone. She would only reply to text messages, and even that was rare. As the weeks slowly turned into months, a lot of her family and friends became suspicious, and even the ones who were actually in Singapore, whenever they asked Evelyn if they could meet up, she would either say that she was busy, out of town, or just sick. And naturally, many people began to wonder how could a mother who cared about her children so much just suddenly disappear and barely message them? Well, unfortunately, these questions would remain unanswered for a very long period of time, and everyone would just have to sit in that uncomfortability. For 2 whole years, Evelyn remained invisible, and this experience was the most painful for her son John, who had no idea what was going on with his mother. But in the year 2018, he had finally had enough, and after moving to another city for work, he decided that he could no longer ignore the feeling in his gut, and that is when he filed a missing persons report. But unfortunately, the police shrugged him off. They pointed out that not only was her Facebook account active, but her passport and all of her clothes seemed to be missing too. And so maybe Evelyn just wanted space. After all, adults are allowed to disappear, even if it feels unorthodox. Of course, this might have been an excuse for people outside of the family, but John, he knew that something was wrong, and tragically, he would have to sit in this anxiety for several years. Fast forward to July of 2020, and it had now been almost 4 years since Evelyn had allegedly left for Singapore. The pain and anxiety felt by her friends and her family had now shifted into a gentle grief that would never leave them. With June marking the beginning of the rainy season in the Philippines, John returned to the family home to begin some new renovations. You see, over time, the house had fallen into disrepair and now needed some refurbishment to keep his sister and niece dry. Still living there with her child, John thought it was finally time to freshen things up, especially the kitchen, which seemed to have not been touched for years. And so, with that in mind, he hired a construction crew to renovate the area, hoping that his mother would be happy to see her newly finished kitchen whenever she decided to come back from Singapore. So, the construction began as planned, but then all of a sudden, something happened. What would ultimately begin as a rather minor inconvenience would soon turn into the most morbid of problems. It was shortly after construction started taking place that crew members reported a foul smell coming from the kitchen. Now, at first it was quite faint and smelled like rotting food or sewage. Many believed that it could possibly be the septic tank which is found underneath the kitchen floor. Nothing unusual. And that is when they started digging. As they slowly started to make their way down towards the septic tank, they found something rather ominous. It was shortly after breaking through the first layer of concrete that they found Evelyn's passport and ID. Now, John was stunned by the discovery. Why was his mother's documents found underneath the kitchen floor? And if this included her passport, then how did she fly to Singapore? As a result, he rushed to the police station and then demanded an investigation. And what they found was quite terrifying. Evelyn had never left the country, not in 2016, and not any year after. So, what did this mean, and where would they find her? Investigators arrived at the home the following morning, and by now, the smell had definitely worsened. The morbid thing on everyone's mind was what they may find beneath. Of course, it is true that, even in death, a human wants you to know exactly where they are. Detectives began to break through the floor, where they would then find a layer of cracked cement, with the smell growing even worse from those cracks. When they finally got beneath the cement, they caught sight of the property's septic tank, and after breaking into that tank, they found a body. Curled up, decomposed, and unrecognizable. It was in that moment that John realized that the remaining parts of his family, including his sister's baby, had all been living above a corpse for all these years. And although forensic analysis was required to determine who the body belonged to, everyone knew precisely who it would be, and soon enough, DNA testing confirmed what John had feared all along. It was his mother, Evelyn. The autopsy was quite grisly. It appeared that Evelyn had suffered multiple skull fractures, which were all determined to be likely caused from a hammer. She had also been stabbed twice in the neck, 5 times in the chest, and had a very deep gash across her right arm. It was due to this brutality that the forensic team concluded that it looked like a crime of passion and hatred, a killing filled with rage. But who would want to murder Evelyn? And why with so much anger and violence? With Evelyn being found beneath the kitchen floor, suspicion immediately turned to all of those living inside the property at the time. That of course being Joanna and her boyfriend Ronald. But of course, these allegations were extremely heavy. I mean, how could a daughter decide to murder her mother like that? And what about all the active Facebook posts coming from Evelyn's profile? Well, as the investigators began to look deeper into this case, they would realize there was a huge backstory and a rather elaborate cover-up. When initially questioned, both of them denied having anything to do with Evelyn's death. However, this was a story that they could not hold on to for long. Unsurprisingly, the police pushed hard for a confession because, quite simply, there was no way that Joanna would not know where her mother was, and she had no idea what to say in replacement. Eventually, she cracked right in front of the officers, a full-fledged confession behind waves of tears and apologies. And for the next hour, detectives would learn and hear about Joanna's most evil moments. As the months of heated arguments and troubling threats turned into years, the relationship between Evelyn and Joanna had started to sour. It is obvious that Evelyn had always loved her daughter and that she would never waver on that, but it's also clear that she was growing increasingly frustrated with Joanna's behavior. Not only had she turned into the rebellious teenager that she became, but her thoughtless actions would end in her becoming pregnant too. And to compound to this problem, her marriageless birth seemed to oppose Evelyn's more traditional beliefs. From that point onwards, a passive war would take place within the family home. Evelyn was nurturing, caring, and thoughtful, but she was stubbornly traditional too, while on the other hand, Joanna was thoughtless, selfish, and had no idea what she was doing. Although the two lived together, they were constantly bickering, and while Evelyn could handle this emotional strain, the more selfish and stupid of the two couldn't. And so, it was in that moment of desperation and anger that Joanna and Ronald began to hatch a plan. It was on August the 20th, 2016, that Joanna told her mother that she had a surprise for her in the basement. And Evelyn, being kind, trusting, and hopeful, followed her daughter downstairs. However, lurking in the shadows was Ronald, waiting for what would be Evelyn's final moments. After making her way downstairs, Evelyn was then struck from behind multiple times with a hammer. She collapsed in response, but at the time was still alive. It was in that moment that Ronald then told Joanna to finish the job herself. He asked her to grab a knife, and only a few seconds later, Joanna stabbed her own mother to death, striking her repeatedly until she moved no more. A few minutes later, they dragged Evelyn's body upstairs, opened up the lid to the septic tank, and then dumped her inside. Ronald then rushed out of the property to buy cement, gravel, and sand from a nearby hardware store, and once he returned, they sealed that tank shut. However, they would make one fatal mistake here, and that is that neither of them decided to install a gas release vent. Throughout the next 2 years, gases from Evelyn's body would slowly build up, cracking the kitchen floor beneath them over and over again. It's kind of morbid to think about, but in a way, Evelyn became the home's ghost, because that kitchen floor would crack several times, and each time, Ronald had to patch that floor back up, completely unaware that eventually it would end them. Funnily enough, but in hindsight, several of the neighbors had even seen Ronald mixing cement over those years, with some of them even reporting that they could smell a rather bad odor coming from the property. Of course, now they know where the smell was coming from, but at the time, they were completely unaware. Meanwhile, Joanna pretended to be her mother online, posting fake status updates and commenting on friends' posts, as if she was still there but in Singapore. She would even write fake birthday messages to herself from Evelyn's account, merely to keep up the illusion. And to make matters even worse, Joanna acted like the picture-perfect daughter on social media, posting morning prayers and gratitude messages, all while her own mother was rotting beneath her feet. After her confession, both Joanna and Ronald were charged with the murder of Evelyn Sayos. Now, understandably, this case shocked the nation for quite obvious reasons. I mean, sheer morbidity aside, whenever a teenager decides to murder her parent, it will always make national news. As far as we know, both of them are now being held in a high-security prison somewhere in the Philippines. But interestingly enough, we don't actually know the status of their case, or how long they are being held for, which personally I find quite frustrating because I've wanted to cover this case for around 2 years now. But for whatever reason, Ronald's and Joanna's trials are yet to be made public. Now, there is a small possibility that both of their trials are yet to happen, but with their arrests taking place more than 4 years ago, I don't see that being likely. This case was hard to stomach for obvious reasons. Evelyn was loving, caring, and not afraid to hold her traditional values, but she would ultimately lose her life at the hands of someone she loved the most. All because of resentment, pride, and love that was ultimately taken for granted. It reminds us that evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it lives right in the same house. It borrows your phone, eats your food, smiles at the neighbors, and then hides a body under the floor. The nature of this case is so horrifying when you think about it, and I have no idea how either of them could have lived there, knowing that there was a body right beneath their feet. What is even worse is that baby will now grow up without a mother, father, or grandmother. I often think about this in my stories, but there really are no winners here. Only losers. We're now leaving the Philippines to travel to Thailand for our next case, to look at a horrible story that happened in 2021. It's safe to say that 2021 was a very unusual year for all of us, with thanks to a certain pandemic. We all lost touch of our day-to-day lives, and had to follow some rather strange processes. This was very much the case for a woman named Nicole Sylvain Weisskopf, who, at the time, was practicing a new tourist program in Phuket, Thailand. And what would happen next was truly horrific. With that said, let me start from the beginning. This is the case of Nicole Sylvain Weisskopf. Welcome to Thailand, folks. Tucked away in the heart of Southeast Asia lies a land of golden temples, ancient legends, and eclectic street markets. Imagine a place where saffron-robed monks walk quietly through bustling cities at dawn, where the scent of sizzling street food floats through alleyways, and where jungle-covered mountains meet sugar-white beaches. Thailand is not just a country, it's an experience, a colourful tapestry of tradition, adventure, and heart-stirring beauty, and a place that I am proud to have visited numerous times before. But for those of you who have watched my videos for a couple of years now, you will know how ropey Thailand's judicial system can be. Although it's a predominantly Buddhist country, making it a safe place to be, Thailand's economy is not only overly dependent on tourism, but also has a relatively corrupt police force. So while it's unlikely that you will ever run into trouble here, just be aware that if shit does hit the fan, it really does hit it hard. Thailand's corruption is deeply rooted in the police force's ranks and operations, where bribes, abuse of power, and selective law enforcement are widely reported. Promotions within the police force are frequently tied to money or connections rather than merit. And as for the wealthy or influential, well, it is reported that they can quite literally get away with murder. From roadside shakedowns targeting tourists to the mishandling of high-profile cases, public trust in the system remains at an all-time low. And despite periodic crackdowns and reforms, corruption remains a persistent shadow over the country. And change, many believe, is long overdue. Today, we're traveling to the western coast of Phuket, where turquoise waters lapping against golden shores are merely just a common experience. Phuket is one of Thailand's most travelled hotspots. Imagine tuk-tuk zipping past beach bars, waterfalls, hillside temples, and sunsets that set the sky ablaze. That is the sort of environment that Phuket is well known for. But with parties, corruption, and even violence sometimes occurring here, it is just another city with a prominent dark underbelly. And sadly, this story does nothing but contribute to that morbid theory. It was on July 3rd, 2021, that a Swiss woman named Nicole Sylvain Weisskopf was exploring the Witchet area of Phuket. At 11:33 AM, a surveillance camera captured her walking alone near Ao Yon Beach. It is worth saying here that news reports say it was Ao Yon's main beach, but they are actually wrong. Here is the surveillance camera that captured Nicole's movements before she wandered up the Ao Yon waterfall, and this is the path that she is likely to have taken to get there. Nicole fell silent after that, leaving her children and husband, who were all half the world away, gripped with anxiety and fear. And as the hours turned into days, they knew that something terrible must have happened. What precisely occurred, or why she wasn't replying to her messages or phone calls at the time, was quite honestly anybody's guess. But for those back home waiting for her, her silence was absolutely agonizing. So who was Nicole, and why was she alone in Thailand? Living in Germany with her husband and children, Nicole was now 57 years old and was a deputy protocol chief at the Federal Assembly of Switzerland in Germany. Of course, this means that she was a political big shot, and as part of the Federal Council, she helped lead the federal administration of Switzerland, which often took her across the globe. As we know, the pandemic severely disrupted the world through 2021, leading to all sorts of weird protocols and processes. And of course, Nicole would find herself caught up in one of them. At the time, almost nobody was allowed to travel between countries, and as you may already know, this was a massive problem for Thailand. I've said this before in previous videos, but Thailand massively depends on tourism. In fact, in 2019 alone, Bangkok was officially ranked to be the most visited city globally, with a staggering 22.8 million visitors that year. Going one step further, Phuket was ranked 14th internationally, with a total of 9.9 million visitors that year, which truly is astronomical for such a small place. However, COVID-19 was sure to decimate the industry, wiping out about $90 billion from the economy in the year 2020 alone. And these stats right here show how badly the pandemic affected their numbers. To combat this problem, the country introduced a new scheme called the Phuket Sandbox Program, aiming to attract tourists into the country with a few strings attached. No arrivals needed to be quarantined, but the caveat was that they could not travel to the mainland within 14 days of arrival. It is unclear if Nicole was trialing this for work or purely was a tourist, but what we do know is that she was part of this program and landed in Phuket on July 13th, 2021. The next 2 weeks were glorious for her, where she spent most of her time soaking up the sun on sandy beaches, checking out the local temples, and eating delicious food at the local markets. Those who interacted with Nicole described her as calm and relaxed, and despite being half the world away from home and in the middle of COVID, appeared to be quite content. Except almost 3 weeks after arriving, Nicole suddenly disappeared. Her family were confident that something was up as soon as she stopped responding to messages, and when she failed to call them at the time that she promised she would, they knew that this situation was highly unusual for her. Clearly worried that something was wrong, they called the Thai police to officially report Nicole as missing. And given the nature of the case, they responded quite quickly. Staff at the hotel would soon confirm that not only was she not in her room, but she hadn't been seen all day either, Not only that, but things like her mobile phone, wallet and keys were all missing too. But with everything else left behind, like her suitcase, clothes and toiletries, it did appear that Nicole had plans to return to the hotel at some stage. So, with that in mind, where was she? That is when officers investigating her disappearance found this surveillance footage, confirming that Nicole was last seen alive and well at 11:33 AM that morning. She seemed to be traveling along Aoyon Kalka Road towards Aoyon Waterfall or Kaukad Viewpoint. However, after walking past the surveillance camera, Nicole suddenly disappeared. And that is not the only thing detectives would find, because after reviewing other surveillance cameras in the area, they found an image of this man driving around the forest. Officials were not sure who he was or what he was doing, but given the time that he was seen, they were curious to know if he had seen or had any contact with Nicole. As the hours turned into days, word got around town. Nobody had seen or heard from her, and anxiety soon turned into quiet panic. It was at that stage that residents and tourists alike all joined in on police search efforts, scouring the nearby rivers, streets and jungles for any sign of Nicole. But sadly, despite their best intentions, no sign of her was ever found. As they approached the 1-week mark, the enthusiasm to find her began to fade. But then, all of a sudden, on Thursday the 8th of July 2021, 5 days after her disappearance, something was found. It was on this morning that an island resident walking through the forest came across a horrific discovery. There, lying in the water and among the rocks, she found a partially clad body lying face down. Taking a closer look, the resident noticed that the body was of another female. Not only that, but she appeared to be mostly naked and half covered by a black plastic sheet. With that in mind, she wasted no further time and called the authorities immediately. Officers arrived at the scene only a few minutes later, where they secured it to make sure that nobody tampered with the evidence. And sadly, they would also confirm that the body did in fact look like Nicole. Several items of clothing found at the crime scene would match that seen in surveillance footage. And talking about clothes, they would also find one of her trainers hanging in a tree nearby. Forensics soon determined that, judging by the color and bloating of the body, this person had likely died around 3 days prior. Not only that, but they could tell quite visibly that she had not died of natural causes. And to add to these haunting details, another autopsy report would soon confirm that she had likely died from drowning. This was a massive blow for Nicole's family and friends, and the residents were ashamed to hear that something so barbaric had happened in their own backyard. Murder does tend to be rare here, especially against a tourist, and as you can imagine, this would be sure to affect Thailand's holiday industry, which always sees a notable drop in tourism whenever one is murdered. And so, in response, the Prime Minister urged all agencies to expedite their investigation and find the person responsible. Now, the authorities did have a body, but what they didn't have was a motive or a suspect. And with that said, many people began to wonder if maybe this could happen again. But thankfully, the officers were very quick to arrest a suspect. In fact, they had their eye on one of them all along. So, do you remember the man seen on the moped who was in this surveillance footage? Well, it turns out that he was not so innocent after all. Officers noticed that this man had driven to the scene shortly before Nicole's arrival, before then fleeing around 3 hours later. Detectives soon learned that the man in question went by the name of Tirawat Thotip, a resident who lived in the northern district of the island. Now, finding him was actually quite easy. They had his face, the model and colour of his moped, and even the license plate. But the real detective work here came from establishing him as a potential suspect, which required careful watching and recollection of all surveillance cameras in the area. Eventually, they would find his address through his license plate, and when they knocked on his front door to question him, well, they immediately noticed several cuts and bruises across his body. No surprise, this was incredibly suspicious. For a man to be covered in bruises and cuts only days after a woman's disappearance, it was very alarming, and so they decided to take him down to the station for some questioning. And, well, it didn't take long for him to break down and confess. Tirawat Thotip, also known as Bang Ri, was 28 years old and unemployed at the time. Bang Ri was desperately trying to make ends meet because the pandemic had sadly ruined his previous job. Formerly a technician in the area, he would then move on into kickboxing in front of the local tourists. But, as you know, now there were none. It was on July the 3rd, 2021, that Bang Ri visited the Aoyang waterfall to search for exotic flowers and plants that he could then sell at a market. But unfortunately, no dice. After checking an old vantage point that had previously worked for him, no flowers remained. It was while he was walking down from that area that he then came across Nicole, who, at the time, was busily footbathing in a stream. Bang Ri was rather quick to admit that the sight of Nicole had instantly turned him on, and without giving it any thought or hesitation, he decided to assault her. That is when he silently approached her from behind before then placing her into a chokehold. But Nicole, she was not ready to go down without a fight, leading to the two having quite the scuffle. As a result, Bang Ri was covered in bruises and cuts, but unfortunately he was too strong for her, and as soon as he had a good holding of the back of Nicole's head, he submerged her underwater. For 3 grueling minutes, Bang Ri watched her life fade away. He then dragged her to the edge of the water and removed her clothes. After taking a glance at Nicole's face, it became quite obvious that she was now dead, this deflating his sexual appetite. Abandoning his plans and quite clearly wanting to get out of the area, he then covered her body with a black plastic sheet which he found nearby and then threw her clothes into the undergrowth. But despite already disrespecting Nicole in the most gruesome of ways, he would only leave her after robbing her body too, to which he found a grand total of 300 baht, the equivalent of $9 US. Bang Ri fled the scene, his escape briefly captured on a nearby surveillance camera. Later that day, he spent the $9 he robbed from Nicole on orange juice and drugs, before then crashing at home as if nothing had happened. However, the mask couldn't last long, and within days, he was arrested and charged with murder, attempted sexual assault, and indecent assault. No surprise, his confession sent shockwaves through the community. The idea that someone could take a life for a twisted impulse and less than $10 was almost too gruesome to believe. As is typically the case for most murders that happen in Thailand, the suspect was forced to reenact his movements and actions on the day of the murder, where both the police and the press gawked at him for several hours. It was only after his confession that Bang Ri changed his story. He claimed that he only meant to rob Nicole and not kill her, but when asked why her clothes had been removed, he couldn't offer an answer, just silence. The court wasn't buying it, and ultimately, he was found guilty of murder, where the judge then handed down the ultimate sentence to him, that being the death sentence. However, in a surprising turn, that sentence was later commuted to life in prison. As for Nicole's family, the Ministry of Tourism offered them compensation of 1 million baht, which is the equivalent of roughly $30,000 US, which, quite frankly, is an absolute insult. The tourism minister also pushed for tighter security measures under the island's new sandbox program, and officials agreed to ramp up surveillance, installing more surveillance cameras at key tourist hotspots, and employing more security personnel at each location. But the minister did not stop there, and also planned to conduct a province-wide review of all tourist attractions. Not only that, but permanent closure was on the table for those sites deemed unpopular or too isolated. In short, this was a very aggressive way for the government to try to increase safety on the island. On August the 6th, 2021, a vigil was held for Nicole on one of the nearby beaches. A framed photo of her was decorated with floral wreaths and surrounded by candles, while locals and hotel staff alike gathered to pay their respects. The horrible thing about this story is that Nicole's murder was not merely just a brutal crime. It was a tragic reminder that even paradise can become a gruesome nightmare. Quite understandably, her death absolutely rattled Thailand, and it sparked overdue conversations about tourist safety. And while no sentence can ever bring her back, her death now stands as a quiet plea for reform and awareness. With that said, folks, I think I'll end this video here. With stories like this, I do often wonder what is actually going on in people's heads. For example, did Ronald and Joanna ever think about the consequences of what they were doing? And how could they live with Evelyn right beneath their feet? Similarly, what the fuck was Bang Ri thinking? I mean, to just murder someone for a few minutes of unconsenting pleasure is just absolutely bewildering. Anyway, folks, as always, I'd love to know what you think about these stories, so please do share your thoughts in the comments section down below. And on that note, I think I'm going to wrap this video up here today. And just a heads up, but I've got a lot of things happening on my Instagram and my Facebook, so please do follow me there. Anyway, that's me done for today. Once again, thank you so much for being here, I really do appreciate it. And until I see you again, please do make sure to look after yourselves and each other. Thank you, and goodbye.